Good day, this is Jove Aguas, and welcome to my lectures in philosophy. Today I'm going to talk about the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. Now, just a brief introduction. The continental movements of phenomenology and existentialism were concerned with questions like what is consciousness and what does it mean to be a person. However, the phenomenologists and existentialists saw no use in analyzing how we use the words consciousness or person, for this would only give us the unclarified assumptions and residues of our historical traditions. Instead, what they did or what they believe in is that we must look to the experience of being a conscious person to answer these questions. The notions of experience and other concepts, however, that underlie their investigations is very much different from the analytical scientific model of classical empiricism. So they have a different view of experience, while the classical empiricists would consider experience in terms of our sense experience. The phenomenologists and the existentialists actually consider experience in terms of our personal experience, what they call the lived experience. How we experience, for example, the world, our experience of loving, our experience of uh, acting, our experience of willing, and so on. And unlike the classical empiricists who consider experience in terms of seeing or of feeling, through our senses. Now, although the existentialist thinkers trace their roots back to such 19th century figures like Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche and Fyodor Dostoevsky, most of them, including the other 20th century continental thinkers, cannot be understood apart from the works or the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. Many seminal figures of the 20th century continental thoughts either studied with Husserl or studied his writings. And we can name thinkers like Heidegger, Max Scheler, um, Edith Stein, Roman Ingarden as those noted followers of Husserl. Husserl received his training in mathematics, and he took it as his goal to make philosophy into a rigorous science. The existentialists, however, give philosophy a new agenda by focusing on the dark and shadowy sides of human existence. With their analysis of such phenomena like anxiety, uh, dread, guilt, death, and many other existential issues. They were at home in expressing their philosophy in terms of poetry, novels, plays, drama, and writing ponderously worded philosophical essays, in striking contrast to the rigorous style of their mentor, Husserl. So, just a quick look at the life and works of Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl was born on April 8, 1859, into a Jewish family in the town of Prosnitz in Moravia, then a part of the Austrian Empire. At the age of 10, his father sent him to Vienna to begin his German classical education. He graduated in 1876 and went to Leipzig for university studies. At Leipzig, Husserl studied mathematics, physics, and philosophy, and he was particularly intrigued with astronomy and optics. He went to Berlin in 1878 to further his studies in mathematics, and he completed that work in Vienna in 1881 to 83, and he received the doctorate with a dissertation on the theory of the calculus of variation. Husserl briefly held an academic post in Berlin. In 1884, he returned to in 1884 he returned again to Vienna to and was able to attend uh, the class or the lectures in philosophy of the noted philosopher Franz Brentano. It was through Brentano's lectures that Husserl finally saw what his final calling or what would be his calling. Brentano then recommended Husserl to his pupil Karl Stumpf in Halle, and in 1886 went to Halle where he studied psychology and wrote his habilitation on the concept of numbers or number. The next year, he became a private docent or a lecturer at Halle. He remained in Halle together with his family until 1901 and wrote his important early books there. His thesis was later integrated into Husserl's first published monograph, Philosophy of Arithmetic, which appeared in 1891. In this work, Husserl combined the mathematical, psychological, and philosophical competencies to attempt a psychological foundation of arithmetic. The book, however, was criticized for its underlying psychologism in a review by Gottlieb Frigg. In 1990 and 1901, his first phenomenological work was published in two volumes entitled Logical Investigations. The first volume contains a forceful attack against psychologism, whereas the much larger, meaning the second volume, consists of six descriptive psychological and epistemological investigations. In 1901, Husserl joined the faculty of Göttingen, where he taught for 16 years and where he worked out the definitive foundations of his phenomenology. He refined and modified his method into what he called transcendental phenomenology. This method focuses on the essential structures that allow the objects naively taken for granted in the natural attitude, which is characteristics of both our everyday life and the other sciences or the ordinary sciences, to constitute themselves in consciousness. He was influenced in this notion by Descartes, by David Hume, and by Kant. In his second work, Ideas, which was published in 1913, already a more polished work, a more polished theory came out. Husserl explains in detail the resulting perspective on the realm of intentional consciousness, which is supposed to enable the phenomenological or the phenomenologist to develop a radically unprejudiced justification of his basic views on the world and himself and explore their rational interconnections. Husserl accepted appointment in 1916 to a professorship at Freiburg, succeeding Heinrich Rickert as full professor, a position from which he would retire in 1928. At Freiburg, Husserl discontinued to work on manuscripts that would be published after his death as volumes 2 and 3 of the Aidin or the Ideas, as well as many other projects. Husserl retired in 1928 and was succeeded by his and Ricard's former assistant, Martin Heidegger, whose major work, Being in Time, has been published in Husserl's yearbook in 1927. In 1929, he accepted an invitation to Paris, and his lectures there were published as Cartesian Meditations in 1931. In the same year, Husserl gave a number of talks on phenomenology and anthropology, in which he criticized his two antipodes, Martin Heidegger and Max Scheler. In 1933, Hitler took over in Germany, and Husserl received a call to Los Angeles, but he rejected. Because of his Jewish ancestors, he became more and more humiliated and isolated. And in 1935, he gave a series of invited lectures in Prague, resulting in his last major work, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. His retirement from teaching in 1928 did not slow the pace of his phenomenological research, but his last years were saddened by the escalation of the National Socialism's racist policies against the Jews. And Husserl was actually a victim of all these policies, being a Jew himself. Husserl died of pleurosis Husserl died of pleurisy on April 27, 1938 in Fribourg. And his manuscripts, more than 40,000 pages in total, were rescued by the Franciscan Herman Leo van Breda, who brought them to Leuven, where the first Husserl archive was founded in 1939. Today, there are further archives in Fribourg, Cologne, Paris, New York, and Pittsburgh. And since 1950, the Husserl's archives are editing Husserl's collective works, named Husserliana. Now, let's go to Husserl's main ideas. First, the crisis of rational certainty and meaning. Husserl believed that Western culture was in a state of crisis because it has lost its belief that rational certainty can be attained. According to him, this has led to irrationalism in the social and political realm. The theoretical sciences have neglected the foundation of our knowledge and drifted away as they ignored their roots in the activities of consciousness that produce them. As his thought developed, Husserl uh, also realized that the crisis of rational certainty was also a crisis of meaning. The sciences had severed themselves from their origins in the prehistorical experience, which Husserl called the life world, wherein all meaning is constituted. So this pre-theoretical experience is our lived experiences, our experience before we try to conceptualize, before we theorize about our experiences. And according to Husserl, this pre-theoretical experience, the life world, is the source of all meanings. And to ignore them or to cut ourselves off from these pre-theoretical experiences is the very cause of the crisis of meaning in our time, or particularly in the Western culture. Husserl assessed that a major cause of the crisis of modern world was an outlook or point of view which he called naturalism. This is the view that claims that physical nature encompasses everything real, and that all reality can be exclusively explained by the natural sciences. Although early in his career, as we have already mentioned, Husserl embraced a form of naturalism because he studied, was one of his backgrounds was in psychology, this kind of naturalism called psychologism, which he actually developed in his first book, The Philosophy of Arithmetic. These attempts to base mathematics to psychology or to our subjective experiences. This idea of naturalism, however, implies that consciousness itself is just another item of nature that can be explained by the laws of physics, of chemistry, and biology. Husserl argued that if consciousness and our beliefs are just products of blind and irrational physical causes, then we cannot have rational justified beliefs. Therefore, Husserl dismissed all theories that undermine the foundation of knowledge in consciousness. One of the foundational concepts actually of Husserl will be his notion or his description of consciousness. Thus started his quest for rational certainty in the same manner that Descartes had suggested or sought before him, and although this time with a different approach. In developing a method that would lead to a presuppositionless philosophy, Husserl became critical of naturalism, and Husserl became particularly critical of psychologism, as we have already mentioned. Psychologism is a tendency to interpret events or arguments in subjective terms, or to exaggerate psychological factors. And he was critical of psychologism because, for Husserl, it reduces the ideality and the transcendence of logical concepts like meanings, concepts, judgments, numbers, etc., to the reality of immanence of psychological contents, meaning the subjective contents of our minds. And it also reduces the ideality and universality of logical laws to the factuality and the generality of empirical psychological laws. In general, these laws, the psychological and the logical laws, belong to two different realms for Husserl. The psychological laws are material, and the logical laws are universal. And to reduce the universal to these particular laws of of the law of the psychological laws, which is material, is unacceptable for Husserl. However, Husserl does not totally reject the descriptive psychological approach of, of psychology, because he also recognizes that insofar as logical laws govern the ideal, the objective contents of acts of thinking, the relation between these ideal contents and the facts in which they are thought must also be explained and clarified. Therefore, Husserl tries to clarify the relationship between the facts, what in the ideas he would call the matters of fact, following the idea of David Hume, and the essences or the universal essences. So, Husserl incorporates the intentional contents into the phenomenological contents on which he reflects. And therefore, he also investigates the correlation between what he calls the noesis, that is the act, the intentional act, the intending act, and the noema, that is the object that is intended. So the noema can also be interpreted as an abstract, ideal, intentional entity, ontologically distinct from the intended objects. Therefore, it's different. You cannot separate his notion of intentionality and consciousness and reduction, as we are going to touch on later on. Now, let's go to his idea of philosophy as a rigorous science. Um, for Husserl, the essential aim of philosophy is to be a rigorous science, and that is, it must have a scientific character. But its scientific character, its rigor, its discipline must be different from that of the other sciences, meaning the science of nature and the science of the mind, psychology. Unlike philosophy, these sciences usually have at their disposal an elaborate system of refined methods. And therefore, for an ordinary observer, for an ordinary person, you would get the impression that philosophy is less scientific and less rational compared to the sciences of nature and the science of the mind. However, these non-philosophical sciences, the other sciences, start from a complex presuppositions and assumptions, which these sciences have not clarified themselves. So, in effect, Husserl is saying that they may have the elaborate system or methods, but in reality, they have a complex system of assumptions which they have not clarified themselves, and therefore they are not as rigorous and as scientific as the science uh, claim to be. Okay? Philosophy, on the other hand, does not want to leave anything unresolved or unsolved, and therefore, according to Husserl, philosophy must reduce everything to primary presuppositions, meaning those presuppositions that do not need to be clarified further because they are already in themselves self-evident. It is in the sense that philosophy is a science of the ultimate grounds. So he is doing a la Descartes here. He's trying to establish philosophy on certain grounds, on solid foundations. Now, in order to achieve this, Husserl proposed the method of phenomenology, which not only guides us in discovering new truths, but also enables us to test the rational adequacy of any truth claim. No? So, his understanding of phenomenology has affinities with Husserl or with Hegel's work, the Phenomenology of Spirit. For Hegel and Husserl, phenomenology is a systematic study of the phenomena or of what appears within experience. So, they both denied that there is a meaningful content that exists in reality that is inaccessible to reason. Hence, they avoided the trap that Kant fell into when Kant postulated that there is the unknowable things in themselves, or the noumena. For Husserl and for Hegel, there is nothing that reason cannot access. Everything can be accessed by reason. And for Husserl, of course, this can be accessed through the method of phenomenology. Therefore, Husserl's goal is to find an approach to philosophical truth that will be presuppositionless, meaning the least number of presuppositions, which means that philosophers should not use any assumptions in their investigations that have not been thoroughly explained, clarified, and justified, just like the attitude of Descartes. The fundamental philosophical rule is to only accept what is directly evident, very similar to the rule or method of Descartes. So according to Husserl, there can be no higher justification for the truth than the claim, I see that it is so. Now, since any science that exists on the same plane as the natural and the psychological sciences, meaning the science of nature and the science of the mind, they have already presupposed both the possibility and the general validity of experience of the world, then the new science that Husserl is trying to conceptualize must be on a different plane. And this new plane is the plane of transcendental subjectivity, which is disclosed by the methodological techniques of the phenomenological reduction. Now, let's move on to phenomenology and consciousness. Edmund Husserl, in his work Ideas, a general introduction to pure phenomenology, defines phenomenology as a descriptive analysis of the essence of pure consciousness. And by pure or transcendental phenomenology, he means an a priori or eidetic science that is a science of essential being. So phenomenology, transcendental phenomenology, is a science that will reveal the essence of being, the essential being. Pure phenomenology is different from empirical psychology because phenomenology is a science of essences or eidos, while psychology is a science of facts of experience. In the Ideas, Husserl makes a distinction between the matters of fact, which is the object of the physical sciences, and the universal essence, which is the object of phenomenology. So phenomenology is a science of pure consciousness, while psychology is a science of empirical facts or real experiences or actual facts or realities, while phenomenology is about the universal, the general ideas or essences. So according to Husserl, the realm of pure consciousness and pure phenomena is distinct from the realm of real experience or actual experiences or facts. Husserl distinguished from the psychological ego. Husserl distinguished between being from actual existence, just as the pure or transcendental ego must be distinguished from the psychological ego. Essence are non-real or irreal, meaning they don't have concrete existence, while facts are real, meaning they have concrete existence. The realm of transcendentally reduced phenomena is non-real or irreal, while the realm of actual experience is real. So when we say irreal or non-real, meaning it does not have actual concrete existence, while real means it has an actual concrete existence. Husserl emphasizes that phenomenology is concerned with the essence of what is immanent in consciousness, and that it is concerned with describing immanent essences. So, to confuse the essences of things with the mental representations of these essences is to confuse the aims of phenomenology and psychology. Phenomenology is a descriptive analysis of being as consciousness, meaning it is a description of the essences of things, different from mental representations of these essences in our mind. So psychology is different because it is a descriptive analysis of reality or being as reality. Okay? So being as consciousness, meaning the essence of things, and the being as reality means how these essences are represented in our mind. So there's a distinction between phenomenology and psychology. which Husserl acknowledged that it is very easy to be confused. Okay? Now, let's go to the natural attitude. The phenomenological method involves taking a certain stance towards experience, and according to Husserl, all experiencing prior to phenomenological investigation is characterized by what he calls the natural standpoint or the natural attitude. Okay? So the natural attitude was used by Husserl in his book The Ideas to refer to the predominant attitude of the other sciences. It is a way of viewing the world on a number of unquestioned and implicit assumptions. And the most basic of these is that the external world is a spatio-temporal realm that exists independently of our consciousness and consists of objects that experience reveals to us. In the natural attitude, man's perception and thinking are wholly concerned or wholly turned towards things. So the natural attitude looks at things, at reality as things, as objects, as facts, and regard reality as fragmented, fixed, precise, and manipulative. It looks at the world simply as a fact world, the world simply as composed of facts. In our everyday life, we are immersed in our practical concerns and we carry on our dealings with other people, with other things in terms of this standpoint. Okay? So we perceive things, we use things, we describe things in this natural attitude. And according to Husserl, this is an attitude that has been taken, this is a stance that he calls taken for granted. Meaning we don't really think much about the facts or the things around us. We use them, we manipulate them, we name them, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, the natural attitude constitutes in observing things, in expressing their workings in singular judgment. Like, for example, that I use this mouse to click the laptop, or I use the light, so I use this switch to turn on the light, and so on and so forth. Singular judgments. Then, these singular judgments are turned into universal judgment. That like for example, all mouse like this can be used to manipulate, to control the computer. Not just this mouse, but all gadgets can be used to control laptops. Or some gadgets can be used to control some gadgets. So universal judgment. And then by a process of either induction or deduction, arrives at concrete results. And it is through this way that the science make progress. But it also assumes that the world and the objects are out there existing and explainable in terms of objective laws. But of course, Husserl has a lot of things to say about this natural attitude of the sciences. Now, the original intuition. So, Husserl criticized the natural standpoint of the sciences. So, he's not criticizing our own natural standpoint, but the natural standpoint of the sciences, by arguing that the sciences were getting farther away from reality. Hence, the cry, go back to the things themselves. So, for Husserl, this means that we need to return to the immediate original data of our consciousness. Philosophy, according to Husserl, lies in an entirely different dimension, what I already mentioned as the transcendental sphere. It needs entirely new starting points. and an entirely new method which, in principle, different from those of any natural science or the science of the mind. The aim of philosophy then implies a radicalism of foundation, a reduction to absolute presuppositionless, uh, a fundamental method through which the philosopher, at the beginning, secures an absolute foundation for himself. And for Husserl, the absolute starting point of philosophy is not any single fundamental principle or in one simple cogito, but in an entire field of original experience. This is what he calls the original intuition, the original experience. So, the starting point of phenomenology is the field of primordial phenomena, a fundamental, within this field, according to Husserl, we don't want any induction or deduction, but solely intuition on the basis of every exact analysis and description. Therefore, intuition or experience, the original experience or the original intuition, is a legitimate source of knowledge. That's why in the previous discussion I mentioned about we need to go back to the original, to go back to the things themselves. When we cut off our investigations from the lived experiences, from the Lebenswelt, then the result is a crisis of meaning and a crisis of knowledge, of the foundation of knowledge. Now let's go to the phenomenological method, because this is the answer of Husserl to how we can arrive at a rigorous science or a presuppositionless philosophy. Intuition or experience implies that subject and object are present to each other on the same level. On the same level. This intuition therefore demands that we first try to arrive at the lowest field of work, basic experience. At this point, Husserl relies on his reductions. By reduction, he means the methodic procedure by which one places oneself in the transcendental sphere. That's why Husserl said, this new science, different from the other sciences, must be in a different dimension. It must be on a different level. And that level, that dimension, is what he calls the transcendental sphere. The sphere in which we can perceive things as they really are in themselves, independent of any prejudice, of any biases. So this is what what Husserl calls going back to the things themselves as they appear to us, the lowest level of work. In other words, there must be a change of attitude, and by virtue of which we learn to see things we previously thought to perceive in a different way, that is, in an original and radical way. The reduction as a change in attitude leads our attention back to the subjective achievements wherein the object we as experience is disclosed in an in a determinate manner, and to the achievements wherein we realize the evidence appropriate to conforming or disconfirming this natural experience. Meaning, when we arrive at that level, now we can see whether this object is really this or otherwise. So the reduction leads our attention to the intentional correlation itself, the intention of consciousness to the object. So Husserl's notions of intentionality and the notion of reduction are actually inseparable. So by reduction, we penetrate deeper into things and learn to see some profound layers behind what we first thought to see. Because when we think When we perceive things in the natural attitude, we may have our biases, our prejudices. But through phenomenological reduction, those biases are suspended, and then we're going to see what really the object is. So the purpose of reduction is to satisfy the demands of phenomenology, to guarantee the purity of description, and to aid in the discovery of the essences which are important to our analysis of the necessary truth. Therefore, necessary truth can never be discovered without the phenomenological reduction. So, reduction assures us that the object described by phenomenology will be the phenomenon or the intentional object of experience. So, Husserl distinguishes two types of reduction: the phenomenological reduction and the eidetic reduction. And that's the next uh, topic that we are going to discuss: the phenomenological reduction. So, phenomenological reduction is the process of defining the pure essence of a psychological phenomenon, okay, of a fact, of an object, okay, a psychological or object. And phenomenological reduction is a process whereby empirical subjectivity is suspended. Our empirical ego is suspended, meaning our biases is suspended. Okay? So that the pure consciousness may be defined in its essential and absolute being. And therefore, phenomenological reduction leads from a knowledge of the essentially real, meaning the concrete, no? The real, the empirical, the concrete, to a knowledge of the essentially non-real, the transcendental or the irreal. Okay, meaning it's no longer, it does not have, it's already out of the concreteness, okay, of the real. This process is accomplished by a method of bracketing or epoche. So, bracketing the empirical data away from consideration. Bracketing is the suspension of judgment regarding the true nature of reality. And Husserl uses the term epoche, which is a Greek term for cessation, to refer to this suspension. So bracketing, or we put that in a parenthesis. And in the mathematical field, when you put something in parenthesis, when you bracket it, that means you do not focus your attention on those outside. You just focus your attention on those that is inside the bracket or the parenthesis. Okay, so bracketing the empirical data away from further investigation leaves pure consciousness or pure phenomena in the pure ego as the residue of phenomenological reduction. Phenomenological reduction is also a method of bracketing empirical intuitions away from philosophical inquiry by refraining from making judgments or expressing our biases or prejudices upon upon the objects. So, according to Husserl, any phenomenological description, which is proper, is to be performed from the first person standpoint, or meaning from the point of view of the observer or of the phenomenologist. This is to ensure that the respective item is described exactly as it is experienced or intended by the subject, meaning by the observer or by the investigator. So Husserl demanded that in a phenomenological description, the proper existence of the objects, if any, satisfying the content of the intentional act described must be bracketed, meaning must be suspended. So bracketing or suspension doesn't mean that you are denying your biases or prejudices. It simply means that you are setting them aside. Okay? Set them aside first. So that the real, meaning by real, meaning the essence, will come out. So, the phenomenological description is a given act, and in particular, the phenomenological specification of its intentional content must not only rely upon the concreteness of any existence or the assumption of existence concerning the object. Therefore, epoche or bracketing, in this epoche, we must focus on those aspects of our intentional acts and their contents that do not depend on the existence of a represented object out there in the external world. And this is done by initiating a shift of attention in which we take up a different stance from that of everyday dealings, meaning from the natural attitude with the external world, and to clarify the sense and the structure of the world and our engagement with it. So, phenomenological description explains the layers or strata within experience by making thematic what is objective and making explicit what is implicit without adding or subtracting from the phenomena. So Husserl said, the phenomenological explication does nothing but explicate the sense this world has for all of us prior to any philosophizing or theorizing, and obviously gets solely from our experience. So in a sense, philosophy can uncover but never alter. So it's to let things be, to let the object be discovered, but not to, or uncovered, but not to change this essence. Now let's go to the next part, which is the eidetic reduction. Eidos is a Greek word which means image or form or shape. And the term was actually used by Plato to refer to the ideal forms or the ideas in his theory of forms. But for Husserl, in, use eidos to refer to the essence. Of course, the essence is also the form, the ideal form for Plato. Eidetic reduction is a form of imaginative variation in which one attempts to reduce phenomenon into its necessary essences. And this is done by theoretically changing different elements, okay? While of course mentally observing whether or not the phenomenon will change. So if I change this element, if I remove this element mentally, I'm working mentally. What will happen to this object? If I remove this, will this change or not? If I remove, for example, my idea of ink in a ball pen, will the ball pen change? Will it not be a ball pen anymore if it does not use ink, or if it does not have a point, a ball point? Okay, so we do that to a particular object to learn which characteristics are necessary for it to be without being something else. Because if I change or remove this element and the object changes, then that means this is a necessary element. But if I remove this element and the object does not change, then that means the element is not necessary. So if I change this characteristic, the object remains unchanged, then that characteristic is unnecessary, because even without it, the object will remain the same. Okay? So, eidetic reduction requires that a phenomenologist examine the essence of a mental object, be it a simple act, be it a simple mental act, or a unit of consciousness itself, with the intention of drawing out the absolutely necessary and invariable components that make the mental object what it is. Okay? So this reduction is done with the intention of removing what is perceived and leaving only what is required. Because we may perceive an element in that particular mental object, but if the perceived mental object once removed and the object remains the same, then that means it is not required. But if this perceived element is removed and the object, the mental object changed, then that means this perceived element is a necessary component. So that means that we have already arrived at the essence of that particular object. So in eidetic reduction, one starts with an arbitrarily perceived individual samples of a particular kind of thing. And with the aid of memory and modification in perceptions, we can carefully investigate what changes can be made with a sample without making it cease what it really is. Because if it ceases to be what it really is, then that means what you have removed is an essential element and part of its essence. So through these arbitrary changes, the immutable and necessary characteristics or elements manifest themselves. And this immutable is the eidos, the essence, which govern all individuals of this particular thing. So we have already known the essence or the eidos of several or particular things. Now, let's go to the notion of consciousness. One significant consequence of bracketing is that consciousness is no longer demoted into the background of experience. The way the natural sciences have, or the naturalism has demoted consciousness. So consciousness emerges to the forefront of our reflective awareness. Ordinarily, when one is engaged in the natural attitude, one has little awareness of the self or awareness of the consciousness because he is mainly attends to the object of experience. But when the world and our engagements and preconceived ideas are bracketed, we discover how consciousness is at work in all our experiences. So the consciousness that we have just taken for granted or ignored is now at the forefront of our investigation and reflection. So it is now on the spotlight. Now the next step is for Husserl to uncover what we find when we bring consciousness into the center stage of our investigation. And what we discover is that consciousness is not some kind of a metaphysical substance, like that of Descartes' cogito, but a series of acts and structures that can be described independently of its contents. So, there are contents of consciousness, but we can analyze consciousness independent of its contents. What is disclosed is a series of acts of awareness that are always correlated with an object. And this is an essential feature of consciousness. And in the ideas, he said that consciousness is always a consciousness of something. This is Husserl's doctrine of intentionality. Intentionality refers to that feature of consciousness characterized as intending or tending towards, pointing to, or directing towards an object. Consciousness is always a consciousness of something. There's always an object to which consciousness tends to, or points to, or directs its attention. So, according to Husserl, all consciousness is intentional. It's essentially intentional. In the core of his philosophy is that consciousness is always a consciousness of something. It's a consciousness of the world and consciousness of the things in the world. Intentionality is the characteristic property of our consciousness. Consciousness is always directed to that which is not itself. This means that it belongs to the essence of our consciousness to form a meaning and consequently to constitute its own objects. Now, intentionality has nothing to do with relations between real objects, but is essentially an act that gives meaning. Its very essence is to give meaning to the object. And for Husserl, every conscious act intends something. If an act is present, the object is also present. And therefore, the character of the object is co-determined by the character of the act. Intentionality is a property of directedness toward an object. Consciousness may have intentional and non-intentional phases, but intentionality is what gives consciousness its objective meaning. Now, Husserl describes these two concepts that are the two aspects of our intentionality, the intentionality of our consciousness, noesis and noema. Noesis is the process of cogitation, meaning it is the intentional act, okay? The act of intentionality, okay? The very act of intending, directing on something. Noema, or the cogitata, is that which is cogitated, or the object of the act. So, noesis is the act, noema is the content, or the object of the act. Noesis is the process of reasoning, which assigns meaning to intentional objects. And noesis and noema may both be means to explain the objective meaning. Okay? The noetic meaning of the transcendent objects, for example, numbers and other abstract concepts, is discoverable by reason, while the noematic meaning of immanent objects, like for example, those that are perceived like physical objects, is discoverable by pure intuition of experience. Noematic meaning is transcendent. Noetic meaning, rather, is transcendent, while the noematic meaning is immanent, meaning immanent in the object. Okay, now let's go to the next point here, transcendental phenomenology. Husserl became increasingly radical in his views towards the later part of his writings, and he placed more emphasis on the role of consciousness in experience. His notion of consciousness as activity was transformed into transcendental ego. So in the beginning, he said consciousness is an activity of intending something, consciousness of something. But later on, he conceptualized the idea of a transcendental ego. That's the ego that is identical throughout its acts. Husserl had hoped to find a kind of a middle path between rationalism or realism and idealism. However, there was always an ambiguity or tension in his phenomenology, and he could not resolve. And that drove him, according to some interpreters of Husserl, into the ranks of the idealist. In his earlier writings, he says that the objects of consciousness that we experience are given in intuition, meaning in experience. And here, consciousness plays a partially passive role as the various aspects of structures of the phenomena reveal themselves to us. Meaning, as we have already mentioned, consciousness reveals, allows the object to present itself, to appear to us, with its essence. So we just let the objects reveal to us. We don't alter the meaning, or we don't give meaning to the objects, or we don't qualify or define the object. However, in his later writings, Husserl speaks of a phenomena as constituted by consciousness. Meaning, if before consciousness simply allows the object to reveal itself, to reveal its eidos, now it's consciousness constituting the essence of the objects that it perceives. In his later thoughts, it is through the activities of a constituting consciousness that my experience of something begins to take shape, from the initial perceptual data to my observation of its qualities, then to the further level of the style and content, and so on and so forth. So layer by layer, sedimentations of meanings build up as consciousness constitutes the object within experience. So it's now consciousness constituting the meaning, the essence of objects, instead of allowing objects to show, to reveal, to undisclose its essence. The process by which many dimensions of phenomenon take shape and are constituted in consciousness is studied by means of what Husserl calls genetic phenomenology. So the question now is, to what extent consciousness is active or passive in apprehending the phenomena, and whether the objects constitute themselves or they are now constituted by consciousness. So, his later position had elevated the active role of the transcendental ego to the point that he had surrendered to idealism. The fine line between the notion of consciousness constituting the objects of experience and the transcendental ego constructing them. So now consciousness becomes a separate entity that constitutes the essence of things. Okay? So it seems that consciousness reigns supreme already in the world in the later thoughts of Husserl. Now let's go to our last point, intersubjectivity and the life world. Toward the end of his life, Husserl shifted his attention from the transcendental individual ego to the intersubjective community of individuals, along with a social conception of cognition. One of the main elements or themes of his transcendental phenomenology is intersubjectivity. And according to Husserl, intersubjectivity experience, intersubjective experience plays a fundamental role in our constitutions of both ourselves as objectively existing subjects, the other experiencing subjects, the fellow man, and the objective spatio-temporal world. From a first-person standpoint, intersubjectivity comes in when we undergo acts of empathy. And intersubjective experience is empathic experience, and it occurs in the course of our conscious attribution of intentional acts to other subjects. Meaning, we are not the only ones who are conscious of our acts or who has consciousness. Other subjects are also, they are also conscious of their intentional acts. They are just same as we are. Okay? So, in the course of which we put ourselves into the other's shoes, meaning we relate with other people. Now, one does not simply experience a particular object isolated or separate from its surrounding. As one speculates on it, his horizon continually expands until it leads to the totality of horizon. Now, this all-inclusive region of ordinary experiences, when we widen our horizon, out of which meanings and must emerge, is what Husserl calls the Lebenswelt, or the life world. So this is the totality of the horizon of all human experiences. Okay? The Lebenswelt. And the Lebenswelt is the total background of our pre-theoretical experience. No? So that is the Lebenswelt, these lived experiences, which we share, of course, with everybody. The Lebenswelt can be interpreted in two ways. First, from the perspective of a single subject of experience. The life world, or the Lebenswelt, can be looked upon as the rational structure underlying his own natural attitude. That is to say, a given subject's life, or Lebenswelt, consists of the beliefs against which his everyday attitude towards himself, the objective world, and others receive their ultimate justification. But from the perspective of a single community of subjects, their common life world, or home world, can be the system of senses or meanings constituting their common language. So that's our discussion on the philosophy or the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. Thank you very much for listening.